medical physics specialisation students speaking. Each speaker has 25 minutes to speak and then 5 minutes of question time. I'll be the timekeeper and I'll be brutal with the timekeeping. And when your time is up, I'll come and stand next to you and stare at you awkwardly and stuff. And then followed by 5 minutes of question time. And so we'll just keep on time. Alright, so I'll just hand it over to you.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. Glad to turn out. My name is Thomas Milan, and today I'm going to be talking about my project entitled Evaluation of the Clinical Impact of the Linac, MLC, and Gantry SAG in VMAT. So you'll learn what all those things mean in time. But since I'm the first medical physics student talking, I'll just give you a brief overview of what it's all about. So what is cancer? Cancer is a group of over 100 diseases resulting from genetic damage to the body's cells. So it's where you get unregulated growth and just unrestrained multiplication, and it causes a huge variety of health issues. Here on the right we've got a skin cancer which has grown its own arteries called angiogenesis. So that's what cancer is, and there's three main ways to treat it which you can use in conjunction with each other. Called surgery, where you cut it out, chemotherapy, chemicals, radiotherapy, where you treat it with radiation. That's what I'm interested in, radiotherapy. And the aim is to use high-energy photons or electrons to destroy the tumour's ability to proliferate. And so, don't worry too much about this diagram on the right, but you do want to just cause as many single and double-strand breaks in the DNA as you can, which will destroy the cells, but you don't want to hit the normal cells. So what you need is accurate localization of the tumour, and you need to know how different cell types respond to radiation. So there's two different kind of specializations that come into that: diagnostic imaging and radiation oncology. The medical linear accelerator is the most common machine used to kind of blast radiation at the tumour. And it produces high energy electrons and photons, and you've got this large gantry which rotates around the patient. And the aim is, to provide high dose to the target while sparing your healthy tissue. And here's just another view of it. You've got a couch here, which is capable of translation and rotation. And you've got this point in the middle, called the axis center. And that's where you want to place the tumour. And it's defined as the coincidence of the central beam axis here, the gantry axis, and the couch rotation axis, ideally intersecting at a single point. And there's different coordinate systems that you can place over the top of everything. So this is a simplified diagram. And you've got the accelerating waveguide here, which is divided into a number of evacuated cavities in which we induce a strong electromagnetic resonance. And this is how we transfer energy to the incoming electrons to near the speed of light. And next they come to this section here where they encounter a bending magnet. And there's different types depending on the company making the machine. This is a Varian model, which it narrows, homogenizes the beam, and it bends it towards this target here, made of tungsten. And so what happens when you get the high energy electrons striking the target, you generate photons with Bremsstrahlung radiation, which undergo then collimation, shaping, and monitoring in the gantry head. And the last level of collimation here is called the multi-leaf collimation. And so that just consists of 40 or 60 pairs of these heavy tungsten leaves, which are all capable of independent movement. And so that allows you to generate non-trivial beam shapes like this one here, and non-trivial beam profiles as well, so sort of cross-sections. And that's just where you kind of move the leaves in a clever way to generate this thing you call intensity modulation. You can use it for a modern therapy called VMAT, where you've got a gantry with the beam on rotating around the patient as the beam is on. It's characterized by simultaneous variation of three parameters: dose rate, beam aperture shape via the MLC leaves, and gantry rotation speed. That's called VMAT. And it's got good conformity, about the same as the other major treatment, IMRT. And it mitigates some important problems, or it's got some important benefits. So you've got reduced treatment delivery time. The patient's not sitting there for as long, so there's less geometric error. and you've also got less scatter radiation, so it's a bit safer for vision. Now here's the 3D view, and you can see the arc is kind of split up into these points here, and they're called control points. And that's just a way to encode this continuous gantry arc and beam arc into discrete pieces that the computer can understand. You've typically got 177. And so they're stored in this format called DICOM, where it's inspired by object-oriented programming. And it's just a standard to contain clinical data. And so all of the beam information and the instructions for the machine are kind of kept in this DICOM-RT plan. So one more kind of point is that when we actually have a complex kind of dose distribution, 3D in the patient, clinically, how can we summarize that information so that you can kind of just glance at it and get necessary information you need? So use a thing called a dose volume histogram, and this is not a dose volume histogram, this is a cumulative distribution function, you remember from statistics. And what we do with a cumulative DVH is essentially this in reverse. So if this is our dose distribution, what we've got is starts at 1, monotonically decreasing to 0, and it's a way of saying, well, at a certain dose, how much of the organ or the volume of interest is receiving greater than or equal to that amount of dose. And in practice it looks more like this, because you have it for different structures. And it's just a useful summary of dose distribution. So, background, where does my project start? Well, you've got the Gantry and MLC SAG. So the linear accelerator has this big kind of gantry that rotates around, and inside the head you've got several tons of material. You've got lots of lead, and you've got these heavy tungsten leaves, and you've got this very strong pull of gravity which warps your ideal trajectory a little bit. It's called a wobble effect. And instead of that point at the isocenter, it blurs it, and you get sort of a sphere of uncertainty instead. The general kind of tolerance level is that every year you need to make sure that isocenter is not varying more than 1 millimeter if you want to give a good treatment to the patient. So, this effect has been investigated by multiple different studies, and there's two in particular that form the kind of jumping off point of my project. There's one for Elekta Linacs and one for Varian Linacs, which compiled kind of a comprehensive data for of this Gantry and MLC SAG. And they did this by placing ball bearings at certain positions and just using clever geometry and imaging to kind of figure out how everything is moving relative to each other. And the data looks like this. There's 6 different dimensions of SAG. So there's, when you get down to it, you can consider these 2 pairs to just form the 2 dimensions of the multi-leaf collimator, so this way and that way. And then you've got the cross-plane and in-plane, so that's just the gantry moving either this way or this way. It's a gantry coordinate system. So that's for Elekta Linacs. And what I want to do in my project is, if you consider a VMAT treatment, how does this SAG data affect the clinical performance? And I did that by looking at 3 different treatment locations. You've got the head and neck, prostate and surrounding lymph nodes. And what that just means is that you've got the cancer metastasized into the lymphatic system, and so you need to treat these lymph nodes as well. So you've got a much larger volume that you need to be treating. So it's just 3 different kind of plans to get a good cross-section of the possibilities here. Now the Elekta data, you can see it came pre-interpolated, so I've got these nice continuous curves. But for the Varian, I had to interpolate it myself, and I used a smoothing spline. And there's a few different trends I could have gone with here, but I decided to just go with the major trends and kind of get a picture of a typical Varian Linac. And what I aim to do in my project is to look at this SAG and incorporate it digitally into these DICOM files so that I can simulate dose distributions and see just how this affects the distribution of dose, so that I can compare them and from there use different metrics to understand how it would impact a clinical treatment. Now there's a problem with this approach, and that if you want to model so let me just reiterate, when I'm modeling this SAG, I want to model a moving isocenter. That's the way to encode the information. But digitally, the systems I'm using and the DICOM itself, you can't have a moving isocenter. It has to remain constant for a single beam. So if I want to model this, my solution was, instead of one beam, why don't I split it into lots of different beams so I can maintain a constant isocenter which approximates this continuous curve. So this is a novel approach. And it's quite a complicated task. But if I were to strip all the diagnostic and I don't know, other stuff, the basics of it is that if I have some quantity of interest that changes over time, or over angle, sorry, with each control point, and I want to split this one beam into lots of different beams because I want that approximation, I have to interpolate this data so that, because every beam needs control points essentially. What I want to do is just keep this curve the same, but have multiple beams instead of one, is the data you can take away from this. And at the same time, I need to make sure the dose distribution is the same as the original plan. So I wouldn't worry too much about this figure, but it's just a way of making sure that the beam output doesn't change. So I can get into that later if anyone has questions. I use the Monaco treatment planning system. What is a treatment planning system? Well, it's just a way to, you give it patient data like CT scans and things like that. You give it a model of a real-world Linac, and you plan radiotherapy treatments. You know, where's the beam coming from, all of those sort of things. And you do this through sophisticated beam modeling. That's kind of the interface that I was looking at the whole time. That's Elekta Monaco, sorry, treatment planning. There is a problem, is that it only accepts 99 beams in a single plan, which is more than most people would ever need. Usually it's 2. But for my purposes, you know, if I want to approximate this as well as I can, I want as many beams as possible. Now, every initial plan had 2 of these Gantry ranges, which limited me into dividing each into 49 for a total of 98 beams. That makes sense. And so that's exactly what I did. It got accepted by the treatment planning system, I believe. And the dose distribution looks pretty much the same, except for around the low dose regions, you've got a little bit of kind of strangeness happening. It's very simple. So I calculated the dose through the Monte Carlo method, and that's where you simulate a huge number of photon histories, and you tally up the dose into these 3D voxels. They're essentially the 3D analog of pixels. It's called the scoring grid, and you just continue simulating photons until the dose distribution has kind of become stable, until you've brought down the variance to within a value that you specify. I specified a variance of 25% with a grid size of 1 millimeter voxel. And you export the information through the dose distribution, they're called dose cubes, and you've got the deviations as well. Alright, so results. This here is, that's the difference between the plan in which I've modeled the SAG and the original plan for the head and neck. So this is sort of what you'd expect, because you've got gravity pulling downwards on the gantry, and so you're getting more dose at the bottom of the distribution and less at the top, and kind of noisy things happening in the middle. So that's just a sort of qualitative way of looking at it. So another question we can ask is that if we take the sag or the isocenter shift, the error, if we magnify that by 2 times, 4 times, 6 times, get it worse and worse, how is that going to affect our dose volume histograms? And so that's what I plotted. And so each decrease in opacity is kind of the sag getting worse, if that makes sense. So like for this treatment site, for example, you've got the sigmoid colon is actually getting better, because that's an organ at risk and you're getting lower dose. But for something like the right femoral head, you're getting higher dose, and probably the worst part about this one is that the planning target volume, which you want a uniform dose, and a perfectly uniform dose just corresponds to straight line, drop off to 0, and a straight line. So you're getting sort of this decrease in uniformity. And so I did similar things for the other two plans. And that's all qualitative still. How can we quantitatively measure the difference? And one way is by 3D gamma index analysis. That's probably the most common way that medical physicists use to compare two dose distributions. And it's kind of complicated, so I'll try and just talk you through it. If we have two distributions here, there's one, there's two. What I want to do is iterate through every voxel in the reference distribution. So say I'm iterating through and I've landed on this one. What gamma index analysis does is that you look at the corresponding point here and you look at a neighborhood surrounding it. And if this point here is similar enough to any of these points, then that's good, and you've got a low gamma score. But if there's no similarity, you've got a high gamma score. And as you do this, you've got a pass rate, which is 1. As you iterate through the reference, eventually you're going to get 90% of points passed, or 5% or something like that. And what you aim for is 90% pass rate with a diameter of 3 millimeter and a 3% difference. So that's what I did, and this is what the results look like. So I've decided to plot the sag by its root mean square isocenter shift, and what we see is that even these points here are about 10 times the real world sag, and we're still passing. So this one was very kind of forgiving distribution for outbursts. And it's important to remember that the acceptance was 1 millimeter peak, so that's about here. And this is about where we need to keep it in practice. So this is crazy amounts, and we're still doing fine. So, but there are other ways to look at it, such as tumor control probability of essentially putting the tumor into remission, destroying the tumor, and normal tissue complication probability, which is what it sounds like. You want the highest probability of controlling the tumor without causing complications. So they're complicated and they use a lot of empirical kind of data. I went with probably the two most commonly used ways of evaluating these quantities. It looks like that, and I'm going to get into it for obvious reasons. But for the prostate, for example, as we increase the isocenter shift, we're getting at least up here, some pretty severe decreases in tumor control probability. So this is, at least by these metrics, getting worse as we increase the isocenter shift. And we would want to keep it, within the tolerance of about 1 millimeter. Prostate node plan was much more resistant to the sag, and that would just be because it's a much larger volume that you're treating, so it's less. It doesn't care as much if you shift it sort of a small amount. The head and neck was unexpected because although the TCP is remaining constant, we're actually doing better in this department, getting lower normal tissue complication probability. And there's a few ways that we can kind of make sense of this. First of all, maybe the treatment planning system in creating this plan didn't care so much about these organs because we're already very low on this axis. We're already close to 0, and maybe it was focusing on optimizing other things like conformality of the planning target volume, and it considered a better treatment as one with maybe slightly higher NTCP for the parotid glands, but better uniformity. Because you can see, for example, the spinal cord here, you can't really see it here, but as the sag increases, you do get a little bit more dose, and a lot of plans have very strict requirements that you don't get any dose at 44 gray, 45 gray. And at the same time, you've got this is the volume that you're targeting, and you are seeing a slight decrease in conformity. So that might actually explain this graphically. One more metric, the dose difference global function. This was developed last year by Garcia Romero and others, and it's a way of you consider a lot of different dose ways of dose parameters. Hard to explain. You've got a lot of different structures, and you only want to sum the dose difference if it corresponds to a degradation in the ability of the plan to meet these constraints. So if you're looking at a structure and it gets better, you don't add that to the sum. You're going to add the deterioration in plan quality. What they found by ROC analysis is that if you use a cutoff of 6.35, you've got a good classifier. So I implemented that one as well. And what we see is that, especially for the prostate, you only need a root mean square isocenter shift of about 2.5-ish before you got to say this plan isn't good enough. So this was another sort of interesting result. The prostate didn't react so well to this, unlike the other two. So with this in mind, I'd still say, 1 to, even like the 1.6 is fine as a acceptance criteria. So there's a few more discussion points here, and that is every dose that we simulated, we're technically simulating a Varian machine, because I was using the treatment planning system at Charles Gardner. They've got Varian machines. Would the result be different if I'm simulating an Elekta instead? My argument is it would not likely be very different, because most of our measurements here are relative to the original, for one thing. And if we simulated the original on two different machines, it wouldn't really be that much difference anyway. But if we want that completeness, a much better way to go about it would be to look at more plans, more treatment sites, instead of simulating it via different methods. But at the end of the day, more data would be better. It'd be nice, but I think it's really not it wouldn't affect the results all that much. Another point is we're discretely approximating this continuous data. Remember, so what kind of error does that introduce? And I decided to say, well, in the worst case scenario, if none of the errors cancel each other out, we look at something like this, and I won't get to it. Basically, you get a roll of them, worst case scenario, 5.3%, which isn't nothing, but it wouldn't really change my results. And the dose distribution, we're using voxels of 1 millimeter, but the sag is sub-millimeter, so that could introduce quite an error here. And that was where the inspiration came from, to multiply the sag values by higher and higher levels and kind of draw a pattern from that, so that we don't have to worry too much about this error here. So, conclusion. The sag is a systematic error which, in severe cases, can affect the probability of a good treatment outcome. But, only in very, very severe cases. But, a lot of times with the slope at 0, it is the degradation in fine quality is still proportional to the amount of sag, even if it's a small amount. Multiple metrics are employed to investigate this impact, and what I found is that it does affect different treatment sites in unpredictable ways. So it would be great to try it for lung as well, upper abdominal, for other treatment sites. But in the end, the validity of the 1 millimeter quality assurance criterion is, I think, completely acceptable for VMAT. Future work, it'd be great to get more data and more investigation, simulate it on Elekta machines or Elekta beam models for a more complete picture. And I only looked at a few different metrics for quantifying the difference, and there are many more that we can choose from. These are two promising ones, which I didn't get around to implementing. So that would be great as well. I think I was able to draw that conclusion from my results anyway. So thank you very much for listening and coming.